Hi everyone, I hope you're all doing well. For this lecture, we are going to go through Chapter 8, the Phillips Curve. Chapter 8 shows how the model of the labor market we saw previously in Chapter 7 implies a relation between inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment. We will use this relation to interpret the different changes made to the Phillips curve over time. This chapter also shows the relation between the Phillips curve and the natural rate of unemployment. Now for some background. In 1958, A.W. Phillips drew a diagram plotting the rate of inflation against the rate of unemployment in the United Kingdom for data between 1861 and 1957. He found clear evidence of a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. When unemployment was low, inflation was high, and when unemployment was high, inflation was low. 2 years later, two US economists, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, replicated Phillips' exercise for the United States and used data from 1900 to 1960. They also seemed to find a negative relation between inflation and unemployment in the United States. Samuelson and Solow labeled this relation the Phillips curve, which quickly became central to macroeconomic thinking and policy. During the 1970s, however, this relation broke down. In the United States and in most OECD countries, there was both high inflation and high unemployment, clearly contradicting the original Phillips curve. A relation reappeared, but it reappeared as a relation between the unemployment rate and the change in the inflation rate, not the inflation rate itself. The purpose of this chapter is to explore these variations of the Phillips curve and more generally to understand the relationship between inflation and unemployment. This chapter derives the Phillips curve from the model of the labor market we saw in Chapter 7. And then we will see how the variations of the Phillips curve have come from changes in the way people and firms have formed their expectations about the economy. This chapter aims to understand and explain the relationship between actual inflation and expected inflation, and answer questions like, what would you expect the prices to be if prices sometimes go up and down but bounce around the same level for the most part? We will also try to answer questions like, what would you expect the inflation rate to be equal to at the natural rate of unemployment? And if prices are always increasing, what would be a good guess for the next year's inflation rate? Recall the price setting and wage setting relations from Chapter 7. The price setting relation shows that the price P set by firms is equal to the nominal wage W times 1 plus the markup. The wage setting relation shows that the nominal wage W set by wage setters depends on the expected price level PE, on unemployment rate U, and on the catch-all variable Z that captures all other factors that affect wage determination, from unemployment benefits to monopsony power to minimum wage, etc. In Chapter 7, we had used these two relations together with the additional assumption that actual price was equal to the expected price level. Under that assumption, we had derived the natural rate of unemployment. We now explore what happens when we abandon that additional assumption. So for this chapter, we acknowledge the fact that price is not equals to the expected price level. We can then combine these two relationships to derive the aggregate supply relation. Replacing the nominal wage in the first equation by its expression from the second equation gives us the following aggregate supply relation. Here, an increase in the expected price level leads to an increase in nominal wages, which in turn leads firms to increase their prices and thus leads to an increase in the average price level. An increase in the unemployment rate leads to a decrease in nominal wages, which in turn leads to lower prices and a decrease in the price level. Also, Increase in the markup over wage on price also leads to increase in the price level. To facilitate our analysis of the relationship between inflation and unemployment, we will assume a functional form for f. We will assume that f, which is a function of unemployment rate, and z is equal to 1 minus alpha times u plus z. This captures the notion that higher the unemployment rate, the lower is the wage. And higher the value of z, which is, for example, the more generous unemployment benefits are, the higher is the wage. The parameter alpha here captures the strength of the effect of unemployment on wage. Additionally, the variable z is an index of the structural parameters or frictions in the labor market, where 0 would imply a Wild West labor market and 1 implies every aspect of the labor market is heavily regulated. Replacing the f function in the aggregate supply equation gives us the following price setting equation. This gives us a relation between the price level, the expected price level, and the unemployment rate. Additionally, let pi denote the inflation rate and let pi e denote the expected inflation rate. The previous equation can be rewritten in terms of inflation to get this following equation. The derivation from the previous equation to this equation is really tedious and doesn't really provide any useful insights, so we'll skip ahead to the punchline. Through this equation, we get a relation between the inflation rate, the expected inflation rate, and the unemployment rate. An increase in expected inflation leads to an increase in actual inflation. Recall that an increase in expected price also led to an increase in actual price. Again, given expected inflation, an increase in price markup or an increase in labor market frictions, that is M or Z, will also lead to an increase in inflation. Given expected inflation, again, an increase in unemployment rate leads to a decrease in inflation. We need to do one more step before we return to a discussion on the Phillips curve. We will be using this equation to trace the dynamic effects of changes to policy or to the structure of the economy. Therefore, when we look at movements in inflation and unemployment in the rest of the chapter, it will often be convenient to use time indexes so that we can refer to variables such as inflation, expected inflation, or unemployment in a specific year. As a result, we will add time indexes for the variables we think can move around a lot from year to year. So we rewrite the equation to include time indexes. In the following equation, pi t, pi te, and ut refer to inflation, expected inflation, and unemployment rate in year t. Note that there are no time indexes on m and z. This is because although m and z may move over time, they are likely to move slowly, especially relative to movement in inflation and unemployment. Thus, for the moment, we will treat them as constant. Now we will use this Phillips curve to solve a problem. Now suppose that you are working for the Springfield power plant as an economic analyst. Mr. Smithers has given you data on current inflation 3%, expected inflation 4%, markup 10%, and an index of other factors Z as 0.2. The best estimates for alpha is 2. Mr. Burns wants to know what the unemployment rate will be so he can know whether or not he has the upper hand when bargaining with the union over dental plans. You can use the equation in the last slide to solve to solve for unemployment rate. You can use the Phillips curve equation to insert values for inflation rate, expected inflation rate, M, Z, and you can then solve for the unemployment rate. And given the data, your unemployment rate comes up to 0.155 or 15.5%. Now suppose that Mr. Burns has made a deal with Mayor Quimby to get rid of many of the labor protections in the economy. This has reduced Z to 0.05. Now you can use the Phillips curve equation again to recalculate the unemployment rate. Using the new information in the Phillips curve equation, we find that the unemployment rate is 8%. Before the 1960s, inflation over time averaged to be about zero. This changed in the 1960s based on work by first Phillips and then Samuelson and Solow. They identified the following relationship between inflation and unemployment, where the inflation rate at time t is equals m plus z minus alpha times unemployment at time t. Why is expected inflation not a part of this equation? Because up until that point, in its earliest carnation, expected inflation was equal to zero, because on average, inflation had been zero. We will later include expected inflation in this equation. Although the book uses a constant pi bar equation or constant average inflation here, we will consider the notation pi bar equals 0 for simplification. Now let's do an example using the Phillips curve equation in the last slide. Suppose that you were given this following data and that the Federal Reserve plans to lower interest rates so that it can set unemployment at 3%. What will inflation equal if you use the Phillips curve from the last slide? Therefore, inflation is equals m plus z minus alpha times unemployment rate. And here your inflation rate is 0.12. But was expected inflation rate really zero? Economists soon realized that expected inflation rate matters for the Phillips curve relation. Expected inflation matters because of wage price spiral. Low unemployment leads to higher nominal wage. In response to higher nominal wage, firms increase prices. In response to higher price level, workers ask for a higher nominal wage next time the wage is set. This keeps repeating as wage increases price, price increases wage, that is, expected inflation increases wage, and wages further again increase prices, and so on. In the 1960s, policymakers attempted to exploit the relationship between inflation and unemployment to keep unemployment low with moderate inflation. They found out that the relationship began to break down if they tried to abuse it. This change came from a change in behavior of inflation. The rate of inflation became more and more persistent. High inflation in one year became more likely to be followed by high inflation the next year. As a result, people, when forming their expectations, started to take into account the persistence of inflation. This change in expectation formation changed the nature of the relation between unemployment and inflation. In addition to the increase in inflation expectations in the late 1970s, the United States saw large increases in the price of oil, which led to both high inflation and high unemployment. Therefore, it is imperative to include expectations of inflation to get the augmented Phillips curve. Let's suppose that expectations of inflation are formed in a fairly simple way using this equation, where expected inflation rate at time t is equals phi times inflation at time t minus 1. Here, your phi captures the persistence of inflation. For our purposes, it will be more convenient to assume that phi is between 0 and 1, because a phi greater than 1 would lead to an unrealistic path for inflation where it grows without any bound. The closer this value of phi is to 1, the more persistent inflation is. The closer this value of phi is to 0, the less persistent inflation is. Now we can substitute our expectations of inflation rule into our Phillips curve. Another way to think about the disappearance of the relationship between inflation and unemployment in the 70s is that phi moved from 0 towards 1. That is, inflation became more persistent, and expectations of inflation started building up over past rates of inflation as policymakers attempted to exploit the relationship between inflation and unemployment in order to keep unemployment low. When inflation rate is the most persistent, or when phi is equals 1, we get the following Phillips curve. In this case, unemployment doesn't determine the inflation rate itself, but rather the change in the inflation rate when expectations are adaptive. Adaptive means that our expectations are built on past values. This relationship between actual inflation, the expected inflation, and the unemployment rate is sometimes called the Expectations-Augmented Phillips Curve. Now let's use the Expectations-Augmented Phillips Curve in an example. Suppose you work on the Council of Economic Advisors for President Selina Meyer. Chief of Staff Ben Cafferty has come to you with last year's inflation rate 2%, the average markup rate 10%, and the value for the labor market index 0.1. He tells you that Selina wants to bring unemployment down to 4% and they would like to know the effects on inflation. You know that the most recent estimates of alpha put it around 2. What would the inflation be for the next 4 years under this strategy? Using the Expectations-Augmented Phillips curve, you can find that the inflation rate here is equals 0.14 or 14%. Now, to find the inflation rate for next year, all you have to do is replace this t with t plus 1 and replace t minus 1 with t. All other values will remain the same. By doing this, you can find out inflation rates for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or as many years as you want. A pattern is emerging, and as long as unemployment is 4%, each year's inflation will cause the next year's inflation to increase by this value because it's fixed, or 0.12. Therefore, in year t plus 2, your inflation rate will be 0.38, and in t plus 3, it will be 0.5. The history of the Phillips curve is closely related to the discovery of the concept of natural rate of unemployment that we introduced in Chapter 7. The original Phillips curve implied that there was no such thing as a natural unemployment rate. If policymakers were willing to tolerate a higher inflation rate, they could maintain a lower unemployment rate forever. And indeed, throughout the 1960s, it looked as if they were right. In the late 1960s, however, two economists, Milton Friedman and Edmund Phelps, questioned the existence of such a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. They argued that such a trade-off could only exist if wage setters systematically underpredicted inflation, and that they were unlikely to make the same mistake forever. They also argued that if the government attempted to sustain lower unemployment by accepting higher inflation, the trade-off would ultimately disappear. The unemployment rate could not be sustained below a certain level, a level they called the natural rate of unemployment. And they were right. The trade-off between unemployment rate and the inflation rate indeed disappeared. By definition, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate at which actual price level is equal to the expected price level. Equivalently, here, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment rate such that the actual inflation rate is equal to the expected inflation rate. Therefore, we denote the natural unemployment rate by UN. The index N stands for natural. Then we impose the condition that actual inflation rate and expected inflation rate will be the same. That is, pi is equals pi e. We can apply this to the expectations-augmented Phillips curve and solve for the natural rate of unemployment. Note that under our assumption, M and Z are constant. Therefore, this natural rate of unemployment is also constant. So we can drop the time index. The takeaway from this equation is the higher the markup M, or higher the factors that affect weight setting Z, the higher the natural rate of unemployment. The expectations-augmented Phillips curve can be rewritten to look like this equation. I will upload a picture to show the steps of how we reach this equation. But for now, look at the second term here in the parentheses. This is your natural rate of unemployment from before. Using the formula for the natural rate of unemployment, we can calculate the natural rate of unemployment for the previous example. And it comes out to 0.1 or 10%. This leads to a relationship between the change in inflation and how far unemployment is from the natural rate. To get this equation, we make two changes. First, we replace the pi et, or the expected inflation rate at time t, to pi t minus 1. This means that the expected rate of inflation is well approximated by last year's inflation rate pi t minus 1. And second, we replace m plus z over alpha with UN, the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment necessary to keep inflation constant. This equation is an important relation for two reasons. First, it gives us another way of thinking about the Phillips curve as a relation between the actual unemployment rate U and the natural unemployment rate UN, and the change in inflation rate pi t minus 1. Second, it also gives us another way of thinking about the natural rate of unemployment. The natural rate of unemployment is the rate of unemployment required to keep the inflation rate constant. This is why the natural rate is also called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. It is also called the non-increasing inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU. It has been observed that the natural rate of unemployment varies across countries. But why do different countries face different natural rates? It could be because of labor market frictions that vary across countries. It could be because of monopoly power of firms that varies across countries. Or it could be because of relationship of unemployment to bargaining power that varies across countries. The natural rate of unemployment depends on all factors that affect wage setting. It is affected by Z, it is affected by the markup of firms M, and the response of inflation to unemployment represented by alpha. If these factors differ across countries, There is no reason to expect all countries to have the same natural rate of unemployment. And as a result, the Phillips curve relationship and the natural rate of unemployment vary from country to country. Now that we have derived different variations of the Phillips curve, we need to understand how policymakers use this Phillips curve relation between inflation rate, expected inflation rate, and natural rate of unemployment. So, when inflation is very high, what should policymakers do? Some economists suggest disinflation, that is, lowering the inflation rate over time. However, other economists suggest that a policy of disinflation is costly based upon the relation for the natural rate that we discovered earlier. To understand why a policy of disinflation might be costly, let's look at a real-world example. In 1979, the inflation rate was 13%, with only a little over 3% being due to the oil price increase. The rest was due to monetary expansion. To bring inflation that was due to monetary expansion down to, say, Fed's target level of 2% in just 1 year, that would require an unemployment rate of 20% above its natural level, which is really not feasible. So using this equation and setting the unemployment rate at a particular level to get a desired change in the inflation rate does not seem feasible at all. Other economists have argued that the adjustment would be much less painful than expected. Robert Lucas argued that wage setters would take policy changes directly into account. However, Lucas still believed that there would still be some increase in unemployment. Another economist, Thomas Sargent, believed that there would be little to no increase in unemployment. Sargent also argued that the central bank's credibility was the most important thing here. As long as wage setters believed that the central bank was committed to reducing inflation, they would revise their expectation downwards. He also argued that a quick reduction in inflation rates would be more credible than lowering the inflation rates gradually over time. This table shows us the inflation and unemployment rates between 1979 and 1985. It also shows us how disinflation did not really work well. See how inflation fell at a quick rate after 1979. Causing the unemployment to increase rather quickly as well. So why did disinflation work no better than anticipated? Some argue that it was because the Federal Reserve eased up on disinflation and decreased interest rates in 1980, and then increased them back up in 1981. This reduced the credibility of monetary policy commitments in the wage setters' eyes. However, this situation teaches us some important lessons. First, how people and firms form their expectations about economic variables does really matter for how that policy turns out to be. Second, past relationships between unemployment and inflation may be a poor guide to what happens when policy changes. This is because, as we have seen, the relationship between unemployment and inflation sometimes changes over time. In the 1970s, the Phillips curve relation that had originally been observed began to break down. This was due to persistently high inflation rate that preceded it. This result is not just through a change in expected inflation, but also through a change in contractual relationships. When the inflation rate becomes high, inflation also tends to become more variable. As a result, workers and firms become more reluctant to enter into labor contracts that set nominal wages for a long period of time. If inflation turns out higher than expected, real wages may plunge and workers will suffer a large cut in their living standards. If inflation turns out lower than expected, real wages may sharply increase. In this situation, firms may not be able to pay their workers. Some may even go bankrupt. For this reason, the terms of wage agreements change with the level of inflation. Nominal wages are set for shorter periods of time, down from 1 year to a month or even less, or they can go for wage indexation. Wage indexation is a provision that automatically increases wages in line with inflation. Now suppose that a fraction lambda of labor contracts are indexed so that nominal wages move 1-for-1 with inflation. The rest, 1 minus lambda of labor contracts, are updated based upon expected inflation. So your inflation rate equation turns out to be this equation. The term in brackets, the first term in brackets, reflects the fact that a proportion of lambda contracts is indexed and thus responds to actual inflation rate pi t, and a proportion of 1 minus lambda labor contracts respond to expected inflation rate, which is pi te. When we solve for the change in inflation, we get this following equation. This equation tells us that higher the proportion of firms that index wages to inflation, the more responsive inflation is to unemployment. So why is inflation now more responsive to unemployment? Well, without indexation, when unemployment falls below its natural level, there is upward pressure on wages. This causes firms to increase prices, but does not immediately affect price expectations, so wages do not increase any further. However, with indexation, the weight setting equation is just W equals P times your F function. Therefore, when firms increase their prices, wages also increase since they are tied to inflation. This leads to a further increase in prices and so on. I have reached the end of my lecture. Please email me if you have questions. Take care and bye-bye.